Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event from How To Academy. I'm Nicole, a producer at How To, and I'm so glad to have you here with us. Tonight, we are joined by Professor Paul Bloom, a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and the Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Yale University. The author or editor of 8 books and a recipient of the prestigious Klaus J. Jacobs Award is now here with us to guide us on a journey into that most incredible of mysteries, the human mind. His presentation will be followed by a conversation with me, and we will end on audience questions. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Paul Bloom.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I read a book on negotiating once, and it said that when you're making a case for something, you should start with the weaknesses. People trust you. It shows you're honest. And then when you say the good points of what you're selling, they believe you. That's what I'm going to do. In my book, I'm selling the field of psychology. So I'll begin by telling you what I see as 2 of its weakest points. The first is, as you may have heard, we're in a crisis, sometimes called a replication crisis. According to some estimates, about 50% of the studies that have been done in the past don't replicate. If you do them again, more carefully, with a bigger subject base, do the statistics right, you don't get the same results. And now some findings are going to fail to replicate just due to random chance. But it turns out that the reason why these earlier studies don't replicate is because we've been doing our science badly. There's been many analyses showing that these earlier studies were sort of unintentionally done statistically, so they're going to give you false positive results. They're going to give you findings even if there's no effect at all. A second worry might be worse. A second worry is that we've been studying a very narrow population of humans. It's sometimes called a weird population, where weird is an acronym meaning Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies. According to one analysis, a United States college student is 4,000 times more likely to be the subject of a psychology experiment than a resident or citizen of India, China, or Africa. And you might think that doesn't matter. Whatever you find in a US college student is going to generalize for everybody on Earth. But it turns out for all sorts of research, it seemingly does have a difference, particularly for things like studies of our social natures, of people's personalities. You find very different results depending on the population. And so we may have been saying that we're doing a science of the human mind, but instead we're doing a science of the undergraduate American's mind. And that's pretty bad news. Now, we have solutions for these problems. We're doing better studies. We're testing broader populations. But these problems have really called into question a lot of previous work, and still some of the current work. When I hear about a cool finding on Twitter or Facebook or in a newspaper about some sort of dazzling psychological finding, I tend to be skeptical because I think single studies just don't show us very much. Now that I got this out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about some of our successes. So the first one I'll talk about is from a long time ago, and it connects with philosophy and neuroscience. And this is the idea that the brain is the source of mental life. Darwin put it very nicely in his notes. He wrote, "Brain makes thought." I think people get it, but they don't get it. So people say, oh, yeah, I know that. The brain is where thoughts happened and everything. But still, we still get amazed when there's these news reports that parts of the brain light up when you do something interesting. There's a New York Times headline I love, which went, "In pain and joy of envy, the brain might play a role." Or when somebody says this sort of learning intervention not only changes how kids think, it also rewires their brains. But it turns out that those claims are just confused. Everything we do is in the brain. Everything that affects us rewires the brain. If somebody discovered some sort of thinking that people do that doesn't affect the brain, it would be the discovery of the millennium, because it would show that dualism is right and our brains are separate from our minds. But nobody's going to discover this because it's not true. So the discovery that our brains are a source of mental life is this fundamental, I think, very interesting, very unintuitive finding. We've gone further than that. So one of Rene Descartes' arguments for an immaterial soul was perfectly sensible at the time, beliefs about the limitations of physical things. He said, a mere physical thing can't do anything intelligent. It can't play chess, to use one of his examples. It can't engage in conversation. It can't solve mathematical problems or do logic. And of course, we now know he's wrong. I'm sitting in front of a physical thing, and I'm sure you have one too, called a computer. And computers are existence proofs that physical things can be smart. They can do intelligent things like play chess, solve logical problems, or really recently carry on a pretty good conversation. And psychologists have taken this one step further, showing how neurons, when properly wired up into neuronal nets, can do smart things, can in fact work much the same way as computers. A second domain that this connects to is consciousness. And here, I think our track record is a little bit more spotty. The philosopher David Chalmers coined what he called the hard problem of consciousness, which is, how can a physical thing give rise to phenomenological experiences? How can sort of a 3-pound chunk of meat between our ears give rise to the feeling of your first kiss? What it feels like to slam your hand into a car door, to hold your newborn. It's still a mystery. There's even a lot of debate over whether it's the physical stuff itself that gives rise to conscious experience, or just the computational organization of information. And this stuff really matters because now we're living in a world of AI, where we're going to be increasingly involved in debates about the consciousness, the sentience of artificial intelligence. If it turns out you need brains to be conscious, AIs are not going to be conscious. If it turns out it's the computational structure, then GPT-10 or whatever may be conscious. And if so, it will have rights. It will be deserving of respect and proper treatment and so on. These debates about consciousness really matter. The hard problem remains a mystery, but we've learned a lot about consciousness. We've learned about differences. This is one of my favorite topics. So some of you listening to me have synesthesia. Many of you had it as children. It tends to go away for adults, but some of you still might have it. And synesthesia is when your senses kind of get cross-wired. So one particular version of this is you're reading words, and the shape or color of the words is associated with different tastes. One famous subject with synesthesia couldn't read the paper while he was having breakfast because the words would interfere with the taste of his bacon and eggs. Many of you, most of us, have mental imagery. We close our eyes and conjure up an apple or our loved one's face and so on. Some have aphantasia and don't. Just I know the idea of a mental imagery for them, it's like a metaphor. There are people who are like 40 years old and said, you mean you were serious when you said you could see pictures in your head? Some people don't. About 5% of the population have no mental imagery at all. Some of us have a voice in our head as we think, and it talks to us and so on. I'm not having a schizophrenic, just having normal reasoning. Others don't. So the study of consciousness is really interesting and really vibrant. A lot of my own research is in a third domain, that of development. And for the longest time, psychologists believed in a blank slate view, that babies are born with empty heads, no knowledge. All knowledge is acquired through experience of the world. And it turns out, I think one of the great discoveries of our field is that this view is mistaken. When you do these clever and subtle experiments, babies have a rich understanding of the physical and social world. Babies, before they hit their first birthday, know that objects are solid. They know they persist over time. They can make computations about their movement. They think about people in terms of intentions and goals. They're even capable of some rudimentary moral evaluation. So in some work I've done in collaboration with my colleagues at Yale, we would show babies these one-act plays. So for instance, in one of them, a character would struggle to make his way up a hill, and someone else would help him up. And then a third character would smack him down. And you put these characters in front of the babies, you say, who do you prefer? Like, you see which one they reach for. And they tend to reach for the good one. They tend to prefer the good one over the bad one. And there's a whole wealth of studies trying to look at what aspects of our physical and social and moral understanding are innate, and finding quite a bit. A fourth domain where psychology has made some interesting discoveries is memory. So there is a common sense notion of memory where it's like you have your iPhone, you're holding your iPhone, you're recording, you have a constant recording of your scene. It's all stored up in this hard drive of your brain. And maybe you'll forget it. You'll have problems accessing it. But if someone asked you to write questions or hypnotized you, it'll all come back to you because nothing's ever forgotten. And I think it's a consensus among psychologists. This view is entirely bogus. We forget a lot. The brain is a physical organ and it decays. We forget a lot. But also, when you remember something, it's not like you go into a computer and recover something that's been stored. Rather, memory is a reconstruction. When you remember something, part of it is based on what you've experienced in the past, but part of it is based on your assumptions about what's plausible and the sort of questions you're being asked. So there's all these studies. There's like as one study shows subjects movies, and then early on they ask, "Did you see the children get onto the school bus?" They answer, and then a week later you ask them questions, and it turns out people who heard this question remember a school bus because there was no school bus in it, but they remember it. In a classic set of studies, college students' parents were interviewed for information about the student's childhood. And then the students were reminded about these childhood events and interviewed about their experiences. The twist was that for each of the students, one of the events had never happened. It was made up by the researchers. This included being lost in a shopping mall, nearly drowning, spilling punch on a bride's parents during a wedding, and being attacked by a vicious animal. In all of these cases, some of the subjects, not all of them, but some of them, will remember these false events as actually occurring. And this is like a real life thing. The example's getting kind of old. 9/11 was a long time ago. But when you ask people for their memories of the terrorist attacks on 9/11, they're almost inevitably false. You don't remember what happened. You remember your stories of what happened. And in fact, most of your memories for like something that happened a month ago or a year ago, if you start telling somebody about it and someone else was there, or there was a recording of what really happened, it would turn out that your memory is almost entirely mistaken. Our memories are far more fragile than we think they are. So far, I've been talking about universals, things that all people have in common, but psychologists are also interested in differences, how we differ from one another. And this connects us to the field of behavioral genetics, which works to parcel out to what extent these differences are due to our genes and to what extent these differences are due to our environments. So one of the findings you probably heard about, it's the first law of behavioral genetics, which is everything is heritable. That is, just like if I know your biological mother and biological father, know how tall they are, you can have a pretty good guess, not a perfect guess, but a rough guess how tall you'll be, even if they never raised you. Similarly, if I know your biological mother and biological father and know how introverted they are, or how aggressive they are, or how good at school they were, I could predict reasonably enough how introverted you are and how aggressive you are and how good in school you are. These traits are carried by the genes. They're not carried by the environment. Now, that's the first sort of surprising thing. It may not be the most surprising thing. People here say, yeah, okay, genes play a big role. But the more surprising is that a lot of our differences seem to be due to the environment, but not due to parenting. It turns out that at least for personality traits, and at least within a normal range of development, how your parents raise you, whether they were kind to you or cruel, loving, encouraging of this, encouraging of that, has very little predictive value for how you turn out. It determines how happy you were with your childhood, determines how much you get along with your parents now, but it doesn't seem to shape their personality as much as we thought it would. It's other forms of experience from outside the home that seem to make us, beyond the genes, that seem to make us introverted or aggressive or kind or do well at school and so on. Exactly what these experiences are is often somewhat of a mystery.